You're listening to another podcast. A podcast not only of reviewing and discussing, but of discovery. A deep dive into a classic show whose influence is immeasurable. Your next stop? Anthology. Hello and welcome to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. I'm your host, Matt Hurt, and if this is your first time listening, Anthology is a podcast where I review the Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer and other classic and contemporary science fiction anthology series. For archives of all of my episodes, visit anthologypod.com, and you can also like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod and follow me on Twitter at OVAnthologypod. And if you'd like to support what I do here, you can become a patron at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer, where if you pledge $1 per month, you get exclusive B-roll episodes recorded specifically for Patreon supporters. And at the $2 a month level, you get that plus TV review and reaction episodes. I recently did a episode-by-episode weekly review series on The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And I just recently released a review of the complete series of Superstore and the first season of Peacock's Rutherford Falls. So there's a lot of stuff there. And then if you pledge $5 per month, you get access to all of that, plus movie commentary tracks and immediate reviews. I recently did a commentary track for the movie Sunshine by Danny Boyle. And I have, I also have a commentary track for Children of Men up there as well. Also Ex Machina, a bunch of stuff. And then finally, if you pledge $10 per month, you get access to everything that I've said already, plus early access to podcast episodes and previously unreleased content. So just for kind of, for example, Patreon supporters at the $10 level at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer had access to this episode that you're listening to now a little bit less than 2 weeks before it went live on the main feed. And then also there are a few unreleased episodes from way back when I started doing a bonus review series on Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams, and then kind of didn't do anything with that, which I do plan on covering that at some point, but you get access to those unreleased episodes. There's 3 of them if you pledge $10 or more. And then finally, on May 21st, if everything goes as planned, the subscribers at $10 at the $10 level on Patreon will get instant access to all 7 of my bonus episode reviews of the new Amazon Prime series Solos, which comes out May 21st on Amazon Prime. So basically, if you pledge $10 per month on May 21st, you'll get access to 7 full-length bonus episodes, one for each episode of the show Solos. But if you are not on Patreon, then you'll just get the first episode, and then the subsequent 6 episodes will be released weekly. So anyway, all that's on Patreon at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. All the money I make on Patreon goes right back into paying the fees to keep the podcast running, all 3 of my podcasts running and everything. And it's just greatly appreciated. And I really have a lot of fun just bringing content over to Patreon. Even though like it's considerably less of a reach, obviously, just by the kind of idea of it and everything, it's still really nice to be able to kind of provide content over on Patreon. And I'm kind of killing it lately over there. So I'm really excited about that. So, okay. Plugs out of the way and everything. Today on the show, I'll be discussing It's a Good Life. It's the 8th episode of the Twilight Zone's 3rd season, and it originally aired on November 3rd, 1961. And for this week's bonus review, instead of doing an episode of science fiction theater, I'm going to be discussing this episode's sequel episode from the 2002 Twilight Zone reboot, to the episode 31, It's Still a Good Life. And I'm really excited about that because, to my knowledge, this is the only episode of The Twilight Zone to have a sequel episode. And I'm just really excited. In addition to that, I mean, this is a big episode. This is one of those pivotal, like, Twilight Zone pop culture reference laden episodes, which I'll get into in the review and everything. So it's nice to kind of reach this kind of milestone episode, because there are certain episodes in the Twilight Zone canon that I kind of have my ear to the ground on. Like, I know Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is a big one, and The Dummy, and a bunch of them at some point. So I'm really excited to kind of get to to this one in particular as well. And much like my review of A Game of Pool, I'm recording this review of the original series episode without having watched the 2002 episode. So I'm completely in the dark about the sequel episode, so I'm really excited about that as well. And also, just to kind of get this out of the way up top, I know that the Twilight Zone movie remade It's a Good Life as a segment in the Twilight Zone movie. I have not seen the Twilight Zone movie because in the chronology of the Twilight Zone, that came out in, 83, I think? Or maybe 85, but in the 80s. And was it the 80s? Yeah, I think it was 83 because I don't know. Anyway, so I want to wait until I'm done with the whole series to do the Twilight Zone movie. So that's why I'm not going to cover that segment of the Twilight Zone movie. Okay, so as is customary, I'm going to read a plot summary, courtesy of The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic by Martin Grams Jr. And just a fair warning up top right now that I'm going to be spoiling the entirety of It's a Good Life. So if you haven't watched the episode, go check it out and then come back and listen to this episode. So spoiler warning out of the way, here's the plot summary, courtesy of Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. A 6-year-old boy named Anthony Fremont has kept the citizens of Peaksville, Ohio, in constant fear for their lives. Able to make anything happen just by thinking about it, Anthony has become a little demon that is capable of changing pigs into monsters and making things disappear into the cornfield. Because he is capable of reading other people's minds, the citizens are forced to smile and think happy thoughts when they are in his presence. During a surprise birthday party for Dan Hollis, a resident of Peaksville, Dan downs one glass too many and starts thinking unhappy thoughts about Anthony. While Anthony focuses his mind on Dan, Amy reaches for a poker by the fireplace in the hopes of ending the nightmare once and for all. Her courage is not strong enough, however, as Anthony gets the best of Dan, transforming the drunk into a jack-in-the-box and then wishing it away into the cornfield. Everyone in the living room agrees with Anthony's actions, stating it's a good thing Anthony did. So, this episode stars John Larch as Mr. Fremont. This is his third of 3 Twilight Zone episodes. We previously saw him in Perchance to Dream way back in Season 1 and Dust in Season 2, right? Yeah, I think. It was Season 2. He has a couple other science fiction credits that I want to bring up. 2 episodes of Space Patrol in 1953 and 1954, and he was in a 1978 movie called A Fire in the Sky, which was about a comet that was set to hit Phoenix, Arizona. I'm not sure if that was a TV movie or like a theatrical release. It was like 3 hours long, but I don't know. It was like a kind of standard, from what I could glean from what I looked up. It was kind of a standard 70s disaster movie. Co-starring as Mrs. Fremont is Cloris Leachman, who just recently, back in January, passed away. I think she was 89 or maybe 92. I don't know. But she had a very long life and career. She was known for her roles in The Last Picture Show, Young Frankenstein, and plenty of other roles. The Last Picture Show is a movie that I need to revisit. It's been kind of high up on my rewatch list for a while, but she's fantastic in it from what I remember when I was a teenager. This was her only episode of The Twilight Zone, but she did work with Serling or Serling adjacent on an episode of Night Gallery in 1972 in the segment You Can't Get Help Like That Anymore. She was also in the production of Mr. Finchley versus the Bomb in 1956 for the Kaiser Aluminum Hour. And finally, she was in the 1956 movie adaptation of The Rack. And other science fiction credits for her include The Iron Giant in 1999, one episode of One Step Beyond in 1959, and one episode of Tales of Tomorrow in 1951. And I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I've got to say it again. Anytime I read Tales of Tomorrow, I just, in my head, I want to read it as like the announcer, which I think is like how it's said in the actual show, but in my head, it's always just like Tales of Tomorrow. So I don't know. Anyway, as Dan Hollis in this episode is Don Kiefer. This is his first of 3 Twilight Zone episodes. Next, we'll see if him is in next season's Passage on the Lady Anne, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that might be the last episode written by Charles Beaumont. We'll see next season. Other Serling credits include 1958's The Time Element, which was covered with Tiny on this podcast in the early days of the podcast after season 1 of the show. And it kind of served as an unofficial pilot prequel thing for the Twilight Zone. From what I remember of it, it was really good. I need to watch it again. Let's see, Don Kiefer also appeared in an episode of Night Gallery in 1972 in the segment called You Can Come Up Now, Mrs. Milliken, and one episode of The Loner in 1965, and he was in 1962's Incident in an Alley. And other science fiction credits that he had were one episode of One Step Beyond in 1959, one episode of Way Out in 1961, and 2 episodes of My Favorite Martian in 1964, and finally 1 episode of Star Trek in 1968. And rounding out the cast is Bill Mumy as Anthony Fremont. This is his second of 3 Twilight Zone appearances. First was Long Distance Call. And next we'll see is In Praise of Pip. And other Serling credits include, obviously, 2002's Twilight Zone, the sequel episode. And he was also in Twilight Zone, the movie. And other science fiction credits are, I mean, he's had a very long career. He was very notably, he played the role of Will Robinson in Lost in Space. He was also in Babylon 5. And he also appeared in Netflix's Lost in Space, reboot, remake, what have you, which I still haven't seen. I watched like the first episode when it premiered, and then I kind of didn't return to it. Whenever they announce season 3, like their season 3's release date, I'll probably pick it up and binge the first 2 seasons. Writer for this episode was Rod Serling, but it was based on a short story by Jerome Bixby. And director for this episode was James Sheldon. This is his 4th of 6 Twilight Zone episodes. We previously saw his work with Bill Mumy again in Long Distance Call. And next we'll see from him is Still Valley, which, if you don't want to wait for me to review Still Valley, you can go over to my friend Brandon's podcast at Submitted for Your Approval, where I was a guest on his show a couple years ago to review Still Valley in season 3. So check that out if you are curious to hear my thoughts on Still Valley before I review it proper on this podcast. So, with the talent rundown out of the way and everything, let me get into my review of It's a Good Life. So, what I knew before going into this episode was actually quite a lot, because like I said, this episode was a big pop culture kind of benchmark for the Twilight Zone in pop culture. So a lot of the information about this episode kind of filtered into my I don't know, my pop culture space. And in particular, when Monkey Paw Productions rebooted the Twilight Zone a couple years ago, their episode, The Wonderkind, was modeled fairly closely after this episode. So a lot of the stuff in that episode kind of in the way it related to this original series episode kind of infiltrated my brain, because I listened to a lot of podcasts and everything and produced podcasts about that show. So I knew quite a bit. I knew that it was about a kid with magical powers, and those magical powers could have him, quote unquote, send people into the cornfield when he's angry with them. And I knew that Bill Mumy from Long Distance Call returns, and I knew that it was parodied in The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror 2 from season 3, where in that episode Bart could manipulate things with his mind. And that segment is actually introduced with a Serling impression, which I'll play later in this episode. From what I understood before watching the episode, the cornfield itself is left ambiguous, and there's a question about whether, like what exactly happens to people who are wished into the cornfield. And so that's what I knew before going in. And once again, I'm going to be spoiling the episode from the outset. And I mean, this episode is unique because it starts with an introduction by Serling, and it starts right off the bat with the opening narration that's more of an explanation. So I'm going to play that full introduction here. So just so you know, it's like 2 minutes long, so it's going to be lengthier than I usually do on these because the opening narration is fairly short and succinct, but this episode has special circumstances, and I'm going to play the full introduction by Rod Serling.
Tonight's story on the Twilight Zone is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. This, as you may recognize, is a map of the United States, and there's a little town there called Peaksville. On a given morning not too long ago, the rest of the world disappeared, and Peaksville was left all alone. Its inhabitants were never sure whether the world was destroyed and only Peaksville left untouched, or whether the village had somehow been taken away. They were, on the other hand, sure of one thing, the cause. A monster had arrived in the village. Just by using his mind, he took away the automobiles, the electricity, the machines, because they displeased him. And he moved an entire community back into the Dark Ages, just by using his mind. Now I'd like to introduce you to some of the people in Peaksville, Ohio. This is Mr. Fremont. It's in his farmhouse that the monster resides. This is Mrs. Fremont. And this is Aunt Amy, who probably had more control over the monster in the beginning than almost anyone. But one day she forgot. She began to sing aloud. Now the monster doesn't like singing, so his mind snapped at her and turned her into the smiling, vacant thing you're looking at now. She sings no more. And you'll note that the people in Peaksville, Ohio, have to smile. They have to think happy thoughts and say happy things, because once displeased, the monster can wish them into a cornfield or change them into a grotesque walking horror. This particular monster can read minds, you see. He knows every thought. He can feel every emotion. Oh, yes, I did forget something, didn't I? I forgot to introduce you to the monster. This is the monster. His name is Anthony Fremont. He's 6 years old with a cute little boy face and blue, guileless eyes. But when those eyes look at you, you'd better start thinking happy thoughts, because the mind behind them is absolutely in charge. This is the Twilight Zone.
So this opening introduction, narration kind of hybrid thing kind of blew my mind right off the bat, because it is a very significant change up in the show. And I really liked it. It really drew me into the idea of like kind of the central theme and the central story of the episode. And from what I understand, I'll read it in trivia later, but from what I understand, it was more of I kind of thought like, oh, this is like, my interpretation of it was that, oh, this is a special circumstance. This is a special, kind of a special edition of the Twilight Zone. So it's going to be like richer and deeper, and it's going to have more like intensity to it. And it does for the most part. But from what I understand, I think from trivia, is that I think it was more of a necessity of just like they didn't know how to do the opening narration conventionally, to have all of the information included. So Rod Serling, I think it was a Rod Serling call, decided to do this different one. So I love it though. Serling introduces a few of the players in this play, and it's more to conceal the reveal of Anthony as the monster. But when he mentions Aunt Amy, he says that she had more control over the monster, but one day she forgot that he doesn't like singing, and the monster turned her into the smiling, vacant thing you're looking at now. So this was kind of confusing to me just a little bit as the episode progressed, but it was a little bit confusing to me because I kind of assumed that it meant that she was completely like mute or completely catatonic. And like that prospect was terrifying to me, like kind of freaky to me, and everything. And the idea of the people of Peaksville having to keep smiling and thinking happy thoughts at all times, that is just such a creepy idea. That's such a creepy kind of setup and everything. And then the reveal that the monster is a 6-year-old boy who can read minds is a really good way to set up the episode itself. Like, obviously for me, since I knew this episode from pop culture references and everything, it wasn't a surprise. But I do think that it sets up the episode wonderfully, because one of the more horrific things about this episode and its premise is the chaos of it all and the uncertainty, the anxiety that the adults feel about Anthony, and how any random act can set Anthony off and send them to the cornfield. And that is just such a terrifying and horrific prospect. And what's even more interesting is that Anthony isn't some crazed world leader or anything. He's a kid. So the adults are victim to the whims of someone whose mind isn't fully developed and who can't grasp like the consequences of his actions, or doesn't have the ability to empathize with other people, because he's a kid. Like, and kids are selfish. And my cat is freaking out, so hopefully the blinds, the sound of the blinds isn't picking up on the mic. Okay, so anyway, it's a hell of an introduction, and now I'm going to play the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror intro that had the parody of Rod Serling's voice.
Presented for your consideration, Springfield, an average little town with a not-so-average monster. The people of Springfield have to make sure they think happy thoughts and say happy things, because this particular monster can read minds, and if displeased, can turn people into grotesque walking terrors.
Happy thoughts. Boy, I'm getting mighty sick of this. Ruff, wow, wow.
And did I mention that the monster is a 10-year-old boy? Quite a twist, huh? Bet you didn't see that one coming.
Good morning. Morning.
Good morning, dear.
Hiya, Bart. How's my boy?
And again, that's from season 3 of The Simpsons, Treehouse of Horror 2. It's actually a really fun segment and everything, and they actually pay quite a bit of homage to this episode of The Twilight Zone. Spoiler alert, Bart turns Homer into a Jack-in-the-Box, which when it happened in this episode, I didn't know that it was that actually came from this episode. So when it happened in this episode of The Twilight Zone, it was a nice kind of surprise for me. Or a nice kind of connection that I made. By the way, my cat was freaking out because there's a stray cat that is on my balcony. Kind of a very beautiful long-haired cat. But it is, hopefully it's not too distracting. Pizza has calmed down. I have opened the blinds a little bit. So anyway, right off the bat, when we come back from the kind of opening narration and we have the title screen, the images of Peaksville really give off this very kind of Mayberry-esque vibe in a positive way. This is a good way. It presents this very picturesque and quaint small town atmosphere. And I like that Serling in his introduction refers to it as a village, and it's kind of referred to throughout the episode as kind of a village. So it kind of has this very kind of, I don't want to say antiquated, but very kind of old school, quality to it. And I do also I want to point out that I really like that the Twilight Zone at certain points gives some love to the Midwest. This episode and Nick of Time both take place in Ohio, which I think is pretty cool because you don't really see a lot of media taking place in Ohio or Indiana, where I live for that matter. Yeah, so the episode opens with Bill arriving with an order or with supplies from the store on his bike. He's a neighbor, as far as I can tell, and he starts greeting Anthony. And on Amy is on the porch, kind of dealing with the heat, and she comments on how hot it is. And I thought at this point that I still thought that she was completely catatonic. So I was wondering at this point, is this taking place before the events of Serling's introduction? And I kind of thought maybe he was explaining to us the aftermath of what we're about to watch, like Anthony ending the world outside of Peaksville. And then I thought, well, or did I just misinterpret the introduction? And I did. I misinterpreted the introduction pretty hardcore. She isn't catatonic. She's just a little scatterbrained, kind of vacant and distant. And I found this interesting because she's Anthony's aunt, but she has the mannerisms and traits of kind of an elderly grandmother, which I kind of thought, I don't know if that's kind of intentional. I don't know what the intention would be for that, but it's interesting to think that by kind of punishing her for singing, he, in certain respects, aged her up. I kind of like that as my kind of headcanon for this. So Bill goes to great lengths to treat Anthony like he's special and to really try to get in Anthony's good graces. He asks Anthony what he's doing, and Anthony's like, "Oh yeah, I made a 3-headed gopher." And right here, I just want to mention that there are a couple of times in this episode where the episode does a really good job of leaving certain things to our imagination. Like this 3-headed gopher, like we don't see it, but we do see him hold up like a tail, and it's, I don't know, just the way he handles it and the way that he describes it as a 3-headed gopher, you can kind of infer like the monstrosity that he's actually playing with. And then later when he turns Dan into a Jack-in-the-Box, we only see the shadow of the Jack-in-the-Box, and then that very creepy shot of him from the chest up swaying and everything. It's really effective, kind of effective visual storytelling and visual, effects, I guess, would be, or I guess special, I don't know, like ways to shoot these unimaginable imaginings, to leave it up to our imagination. So, anyway, Anthony says that he's tired of it now, so he's going to make it be dead. And he points at it, he stands and points at it and says, be dead, gopher, you be dead. And man, it's so chilling to me. Like everything Anthony says in this episode just feels very chilling, because giving this power to a 6-year-old is specifically terrifying because he lacks the capacity for empathy and he doesn't consider consequences for his actions, like I said before. And by doing that, that makes him extraordinarily dangerous. And I feel like this episode really demonstrates that danger in a very effective way throughout all of the adult characters and their reactions to Anthony. It's really great. So Bill goes into the Fremont's house and, before that, he is continuing to, butter up Anthony, and it's way overcompensating. He says, like, we love that boy, we sure do. And I found that really intriguing because it takes on the quality of, like, Bill himself takes on the quality of kind of like the interpretation I have of it is that it's like a peasant who's groveling or otherwise seeking the approval of a king, who has the power to destroy him with just a stroke of a pen, or did I have pen? I don't know. The stroke of imagination. And I just found that really interesting because that permeates throughout the entire episode. These adults are kind of supplicant and they are terrified of Anthony. And I just love the the overcompensating that they do when they're talking to Anthony or about Anthony, even when he's not within earshot. And so Bill goes in to deliver the goods to Mrs. Fremont, and they have a conversation. He's telling her about how out of stock everything is, which I thought was really good world building. He mentions that they haven't had bar soap for over a year. And then that's my first viewing. That's where I was like, oh, okay, we are in progress. Like the introduction wasn't prepping us for what was to come. It was telling us what had happened before. And then Bill brings out the tomato soup. He's like, oh yeah, I found this tomato soup. I thought we were all out, and Anthony loves tomato soup. Won't you tell Anthony that I got it for him because I knew he liked it? And Mrs. Fremont reassures him and says like, oh, Anthony likes you. He tells me that he likes you. It's fine. It's fine. But you still get that sense of fear in Bill, which I think is really great. And I love that he's the introduction for us of the adults dealing with Anthony, as I'll kind of discuss as I go on with the review. So Mrs. Fremont confides in Bill that Anthony created a new animal yesterday that almost bit him. And I love, 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 love this scene because she starts to say, I wish it would have bit him, or I wish it would have. I think she stops short of saying bit him, but I kind of wonder if that is supposed to be her wishing that it would have bit him so that he would learn, that, pain hurts and like there are consequences for his playing and his actions and everything. Or is it a more sinister thought in which he kind of wishes that, he would have suffered an accident and, the town could be okay. But either way, the horror of that statement by a mother is really exemplified in Cloris Leachman's performance. Just the exhaustion and fear that they all have to live in is palpable throughout the whole episode. Yet in this scene, she lets her guard down for just a brief moment to say what she's really thinking, only to stop herself short of saying it because of the horror within the thought, and also because, he could hear her or read her mind. I thought that was just a really fantastic moment in the episode. And it kind of brings me into a kind of sidetrack that I want to go into about how Anthony Fremont's power relates to, can be kind of applied to abusive relationships and the fear within them. So the adults have to walk on pins and needles solely to try not to incur someone's wrath. And I can see a clear application of this dynamic to the very real and horrifying and tragic and terrible dynamics present in abusive relationships. So people in abusive relationships fear setting off their abuser and live in a state of almost constant anxiety and self-censorship to try to appease their abuser in the interest of their own mental and physical safety. And when viewing It's a Good Life through that lens, this episode really delivers some powerful subtext and kind of some really powerful themes about dealing with someone who is in control of you, who you don't want to be in control of you. I just kind of found that correlation really interesting, and I'm sure that there are multitudes of people who could kind of speak to that in a better way than I could, but I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on that as a kind of correlation that I made for the episode into real life. So Mrs. Fremont invites Bill to TV night that night, and she mentions that there's going to be a surprise party for Dan Hollis. And here I really like Bill's hesitation. Like, he is so terrified of Anthony. He's so terrified of what might happen. And again, I like how this is our introduction to the adults' reactions to Anthony, because this is a heightened, Bill's reaction is in his interaction with Anthony is a heightened sense of just fear and anxiety over what Anthony can do to him at any moment. And that is a very powerful way to introduce us to the dynamic within Peaksville. Like, actually show us the dynamic as opposed to, not relying solely on Serling's introduction. Oh, wow. Excuse me. Serling's introduction. So Mrs. Fremont then goes outside and asks Amy where Anthony is. And she says that he went into the barn. And I really like that Mrs. Fremont corrects Amy when Amy says, like, oh, it's hot out and everything, and I tried to tell him not to go into the barn, but he wouldn't listen or whatever. And I really like that Mrs. Fremont kind of corrects Amy and says that she needs to be positive all the time, and reassures her that it's a good thing that Anthony goes into the barn. And what I found really compelling was the way that Amy doesn't understand that. She doesn't know why they can't talk about him when he's not around. And I think it's specifically because he damaged her brain because she sang, which is just really just disturbing and just a complete level of horror within the episode. And then Mrs. Fremont also corrects her and says, I wouldn't say that it's hot out. I'd say it's just right. It's a real good day. And while she's doing that, she keeps buttoning up Amy's shirt. And I found that just really like a nice like bit of detail, because the implication is that, okay, well, she needs to not show any evidence of her being uncomfortable with the heat or anything, because Anthony would construe that as negative thoughts and would send her to the cornfield or turn her into a jack-in-the-box or something. And then also, as a stupid joke I have here, at its heart, this episode is all about keeping a positive attitude. Which, yeah, whatever. So then the next scene has another adult interaction with Anthony. This time it's Mr. Fremont, his father. He's either shaving or washing his face in a basin or something. I don't know. But Anthony is behind him. And first of all, this kind of, like, the idea of like an adult doing just, basic adult stuff. And then, like, the camera swoops over and you see a 6-year-old boy standing behind him staring at him. And it makes it kind of creepy. It's kind of scary. It's just, I love that about this show, about this episode, is that it has by design taken one of the most, like, innocent images you could have of just like of a cute little 6-year-old boy and turned it into a monster and turned it into something to cause panic within you. I just really like that. So we get a little bit more backstory as to Anthony's power and his use of his power. And Mr. Fremont mentions that, oh, you were in the barn and you didn't do anything like you did last year when you turned the pigs into monsters, did you? And I just love the way that every line that the adults say toward Anthony or about Anthony is just layered in this constant reassurance, to reassure Anthony that he's in the right, that he does good stuff. And I think that there is a parallel to make with, like, helicopter parents and constant reassurance and not teaching them and everything, but I am not anywhere near qualified to comment on that correlation at all. I don't have kids, don't think I'll ever have kids. Fine. But anyway, so I really like Mr. Fremont's interactions with Anthony because they take on this slightly more practiced and parental energy. And that's in a very stark contrast with Bill's interactions with him earlier. It almost seems like Mr. Fremont's conversations with Anthony in this scene, it almost makes it seem normal. It almost makes it seem like he's like, it's more comfortable. It's more of a father-son conversation to an extent, because it's still layered with that constant reassurance and everything. But when Anthony looks under the bed, Mr. Fremont turns and he sounds a bit more frightened in that, just slightly more frightened. And I really like that because he doesn't know what Anthony's doing, what Anthony's thinking, and he's trying to kind of balance this conversation with his son who could kill him at any moment with just the blink of an eye. And I found that to be a really interesting dynamic and in the scene in particular. And so Mr. Fremont mentions Dan Hollis' surprise birthday party. And at this point, this is the third reference in as many scenes to Dan Hollis' surprise birthday party, because Mrs. Fremont mentions it to Amy when she's outside. And that's not a criticism at all, because I actually really like that, because knowing the tragedy that is going to befall the party, it makes for some good tension building. But on an even deeper level, it feels even more sad. Like, this small community, this village, is all that's left in the world. And in terms of social gatherings, this is an event for the adults. And you kind of get the sense, maybe I'm projecting a little bit because pandemic life, but the idea that, oh, they're all going to huddle together, they're going to celebrate their friend's birthday, Anthony's going to put on some TV and everything for everyone, it's going to be an event. I just found that to be particularly interesting in terms of, and sad on a deep level, for just the sense of community that this village has lost because they are under the thumb of a crazy 6-year-old. And it also has this risk because they are under the thumb of Anthony, like I said. And I don't know. I just kind of feel like this all resonates slightly during the COVID pandemic. Like, the people who probably went to great lengths to avoid the precautions that the CDC listed and everything, and actually had gatherings despite that, like, the risk of catching COVID is the risk of being, sent to the cornfield by Anthony. I don't know. But anyway, so Anthony talks about making television for everyone tonight. And another stupid joke is that the true monster of this episode, the true monstrosity of Anthony, is that he has now become a TV executive. Which, yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was kind of funny. But anyway, so Anthony then complains that no kids came over to play with him today. And Mr. Fremont mentions that the last time kids came over, Anthony wished them away into the cornfield. And this, I thought, was just beautiful, beautiful dialogue. Because he says their mommy and daddy were very upset. And Anthony says, about what? Like, he has no sense of consequence, no sense of empathy or anything. And Mr. Fremont says, well, if you wish people away like that, there won't be no one left. And I just thought that was a really interesting view of parenting, because Mr. Fremont is gentle with him and not as terrified as Bill was. And I just found that contrast really, really engaging and really interesting. And I found it because I assume that it's because Anthony is his son. And even though Anthony is a monster, and even though Mr. Fremont is constantly at risk of being sent away and murdered by his son just for the slightest of offenses, he's still Mr. Fremont's blood. And it still has this care of parenting in his dialogue with him. So anyway, then a dog starts barking, and Anthony goes into this whole spiel about how he doesn't like dogs, and dogs don't like him, and I hate anyone who doesn't like me. And I just want to say Bill Mumy is fantastic in this. It just absolutely fantastic. Like, he was creepy as like a kind of a disturbed kid with a magic phone in Long Distance Call, but the energy he brings to this role is just on an entirely different level. Like, he is outright terrifying in some scenes, and he plays it so well. It's really fantastic acting. And so then he's kind of reminiscing about how a neighbor thought that it was a bad thing that Anthony wished away all the electricity in automobiles, and he says that he doesn't remember who it was. Like, who was the neighbor who thought bad things about me? And it's just like that alone gives such a level of sociopathic logic to Anthony's interactions and his viewpoint. And it's also just terrifying because he doesn't even remember the people that he kills. Like, he just murdered someone, and just because he had a bad thought about him. And he doesn't remember who it was or anything. Granted, he's a 6-year-old, but also it's just so disturbing on so many levels. And so that's chilling. But that next line, the next line is like one of the best lines in the entire episode. Because he says he shouldn't have thought those bad thoughts. That's why I made him go on fire. And holy hell, like that, like I said, it's one of the best lines. It's horrifying. And the fact that it's coming out of the mouth of a child and the clear disconnect and lack of awareness of his actions is just horrifying. And I was like, it was a moment where I like audibly gasped when I watched it for the first time. Because it is so casual. That's why I made him go on fire. And again, this episode, the dialogue especially, does such a great job of creating this theater of the mind, this imagination. It turns the gears in your mind to imagine this. So I just imagine like someone being lit on fire randomly, and that is horrifying and chilling. And I love it. I loved it so much. So the dog is barking more, and Anthony goes to the window, and he says he doesn't like me. He's a bad dog. And this is where we're about to come to the act break, but when he says he's a bad dog, his eyes bulge out, and it's pretty creepy. And that's when he sends the dog to the cornfield. He just says nonchalantly to his dad, I put him in the cornfield. And I love this very next like moment, because Anthony leaves the room, and then Mrs. Fremont rushes in, and she's frantic. She's like, oh, Bill Soames's dog was outside and now he's not. What happened? And Mr. Fremont's like, oh, wasn't it a great thing that Anthony did that he put the dog in the cornfield and everything. And just like that, just that hyper, crazed like reassurance, just on reflex is just really, really disturbing. And there's like a bit of horror to this as well, in that Mrs. Fremont knew Anthony was with his father, presumably. And I get the sense that, she was terrified that Mr. Fremont was in danger, because just imagine, like, your son, who is a monster, is upstairs with your husband, and you hear a dog barking, and the dog barking completely ceases, and the dog disappears. You're going to frantically run up the stairs and check on your husband. And like, that is just super creepy and super, just really, really effective storytelling. And then there's also the underlying tragedy of Bill losing his dog, which I kind of wish would have been explored a little bit more, or, I would have liked a follow-up scene on this, because there's hardly anyone left in the entire world. There's hardly any dogs left either. And the dog is presumably Bill's only companion. Although in the party scene, assuming that that's the same Bill, which I would assume it is the same Bill, the person that delivered the goods, he is on the stairs with a woman. So I guess he has a companion or what have you. But just the idea that like this dog just is gone from Bill's life is just really, really tragic and everything. And I kind of wish that maybe Bill could have been the one to consider getting a weapon at the end instead of Amy, but I guess Amy actually makes more sense just because of what he's done to her in the past and everything. So I don't know. It's like a minor kind of nitpick on my part, but I kind of wish that there was a little bit more to the dog disappearance and the fallout of that. But they only have a finite amount of time to tell the story, and the story is amazing. So I can't fault it too much. So we get our act break, and then we come back, and it's TV night in Peaksville. And the first shot we see is of Dan's face. And I thought this was interesting as well, because we're now halfway through the episode, and this is the first we've seen Dan Hollis. We've heard many references to his party, but we don't know him at all. We don't know Dan yet. And this is an interesting structure for the episode, because, like I said, we don't know him, but we feel for him when he has his outbursts, because the adults are a community. Like, they're as close-knit as you can get, because they're the only people that still exist on the planet. And I don't fault the show for not introducing us to Dan early in the episode. In fact, I think it's a powerful moment in the storytelling of the episode, because it creates the tragedy of Dan Hollis as being an extension of the tragedy of the community of adults. And I just found that really a really cool way to kind of bring us into the second half of the episode. And so we see on the TV that dinosaurs are fighting each other, and the adults all look vaguely distraught and bored. And I feel like it's because Anthony's attention is on the TV, and this is their only chance to really showcase their true feelings, or show their true thought, like maybe not their true thoughts, but like actually express themselves through like facial expressions. And this scene just really quickly, it felt a little bit reminiscent of the group watching TV in the opening scene of the episode Static. And of course, the dinosaurs remind me of the shot from the Odyssey of Flight 33. And the way that the adults cheer, the applause and the cheering for Anthony is so unsettling. Like, it just feels so hollow and empty and just like so performative and like lacking of enthusiasm, because they are just so drained. Their energy is gone. They are just doing this just because, Anthony needs that reassurance. So we get Dan's birthday surprise, which is his wife Ethel giving him a gift, which is a Perry Como record. And immediately when I first saw this episode, I was like, uh-oh, Anthony doesn't like singing. This is going to be bad. And also it makes me think of the movie Blast from the Past, because there's a scene where Brendan Fraser is being driven by Alicia Silverstone. And the premise is that he is a 30-something year old man who was born in a bomb shelter that his parents were in for 30 years because they thought that the country had been nuked. And so he goes up to the surface, so he doesn't know anything. But anyway, he plays Perry Como on the radio in the car, and he's like, I could die right now. Like, he's very enthusiastic about it. And Alicia Silverstone's like, this? Really? Anyway, so Dan Hollis asks if they can listen to it and just the orchestra part before the singing. And Mr. Fremont's like, no, I don't think that's a good idea because we don't know when the singing will start and everything. So better you better just wait until you get home and listen to it. And I really love this overall feeling of just sheer dread and terror that's amidst everyday normal things. Like, this is he just wants to play a record with his friends for his birthday, and he can't do that. And that is also another bit of underlying sadness and tragedy to all of this, because at first glance, you'd think, dude, just wait till you get home. Like just wait till you get home. It's not that big of a deal. But when you examine it more deeply, the idea that this man just wants to listen to music on his birthday with his friends kind of makes it so much more sad, because like I said, the adults are a community. They're the only people on the planet, presumably, and they are a community. And so Anthony has the adults living in constant fear, but there's, while he does have that kind of control over them, there's also this additional slow death of the community aspect of it all. And the fact that Dan can't play music at his own birthday party that he wants to listen to, that he's so desperate to listen to this record because he hasn't heard new music in years. And he can't do that. He can't share this moment with his friends because there's a force that will reckon with him and destroy everything. It's really tragic and it's really tragic and sad. But have no fear, because Pat Riley is going to be tickling the ivories, which I don't know why I'm so like I really like that phrasing in terms of like describing playing the piano. Like, oh, I don't know, tickling the ivories. I don't know. It's been stuck in my head for a while. Anyway, he stops. He starts playing music, and then he stops and he says, "It would be good if Anthony told me what to play. Like, it would be really good if you told me what you wanted to hear." And also, just to add to the sadness of it, that's kind of sad because it's Dan's birthday party, but it's all about satisfying Anthony. So he plays something called Moonglow, and as he's playing it, Dan is in the background making noise, getting a drink. And I love this line read by Bill Mumy, because Anthony turns around and says, "Don't make any music when don't make any noise when the music is playing." And he does it in such a just authoritative tone that you haven't heard from him in this episode yet. And it is very, very unsettling and very chilling. And I don't know if this is something that other people reacted to it with, but for some reason, it reminds me of like an old timey gangster, or like even like someone from like a Scorsese movie, like just flexing his power among over other people. Like, don't like he says, don't make any noise when the music is playing. Like, just this innocuous thing, and then exerting his exemplifying or demonstrating his power over other people by saying, like, just flexing, and saying like, just don't make any noise. Like, that's just, it's such a power move, and it's unsettling. So then, as Dan is continuing to drink, Ethel goes up to him and pleads with him not to say anything or make any noise. And just all of that is just so creepy and unsettling, because at the heart, it's a kid that is in control of everything, and it's so volatile and scary. And so Dan kind of ignores her and drinks some more brandy, and then he goes on to proselytize about the lack of liquor and alcohol on the planet. He talks about how there only being 5 bottles of brandy left in the whole village and the whole world, and he stumbles as he's kind of opining the loss of adult beverages. He stumbles, and everyone looks to Anthony. And I really think it's interesting how Dan's breakdown begins with this talk about brandy and how there's only 5 bottles of whiskey left. Because the adults are trapped by Anthony, and the thing that Dan is bemoaning the loss of is alcohol, which are adult beverages. Like, they don't register for Anthony as anything that's needed or anything that is on his mind at all. And it really plays up the trauma and the psychological effects of being at the whim of a child monster. And it really kind of brings home this idea of this child is like, he's 6 years old. I mean, kids are selfish. Like they don't see past their own desires and their own like wishes. And this is like that dialed up to 11 with a monster with superpowers. And it's so interesting that Dan kind of, one of his breaking points is the lack of alcohol that's going to exist when the finite supply that they have runs out. And so Dan kind of, it amps up a bit. He yells that he can't even play the record that he got for his birthday, and then he throws a glass into the fireplace. And the way that Anthony reacts to that, like he looks and he shrugs it off, and it's so scary in its own unique way, because you think like, oh, he's going to freak out. He's going to stand up and point to Dan and send him to the cornfield and destroy him and kill him. But he just shrugs it off. And it's like, it's just, it plays into that chaotic nature and the anxiety therein within the premise of this episode, because this kid is in control of everything. This kid can destroy anyone with the point of a finger, and having something that you would think would trigger that reaction in him, not even register with him, is just as terrifying as him sending anyone to the cornfield. It's really cool storytelling and really scary. So Dan then doubles down and goes full crazy on this. He goes up to Pat and tells him not to play the music and instead to play Happy Birthday. And he starts to sing Happy Birthday. And like my notes are just like, oh, this is intense. I'm scared. And like, I assumed that Anthony was going to send him to the cornfield at that moment. Like, I assumed that that was going to be the end of Dan. So I put in my notes, like, the fact that it's him singing Happy Birthday to himself, and that is going to get his life ended, is really horrific and tragic. But what I thought was really interesting is that that's not really what triggered, like, that's not what sends him to the cornfield or turns him into a jack-in-the-box. But aside from that, just the fact that he's singing it to himself is just really depressing. And so Ethel yells for him to stop, but then she's held back by others and they cover her mouth. I thought that was amazing. Just like this kind of spectator aspect to it, and trying to save as many adults in the room as possible, because they can kind of see the writing on the wall. They know what's going to happen. And like the shots of Anthony's face when Dan singing is just chilling. So anyway, Dan stumbles and he breaks a lamp, and that's when he breaks down and he really goes like full on, like we need to do something here. He blames Mr. and Mrs. Fremont for having Anthony. It's just, man, that is it's so amazing to me, because he's like, you had to go and have him. You had to have him. You had to create him. And, then I have in my notes that he commits suicide by singing "You Are My Sunshine." And the way that Anthony just stands up and leers at him, kind of with his head cocked a little bit, is really, really unsettling, because you know what is about to happen. Or you don't really know what's about to happen, because I had no idea that Jack in the Box was going to happen. But I thought it was also interesting that while Dan was yelling at Mr. and Mrs. Fremont, telling them that they shouldn't have had him and he's a monster and everything, I found it interesting that I feel like Anthony, like that insult and insinuation by Dan that was leveled at the Fremonts, like you had to go and have him, that didn't even register with Anthony as an insult, because he's a kid. He doesn't like understand kind of more complex accusations and insults and thoughts and everything that are pointed at him indirectly. So I thought that was interesting. So then Dan outright calls Anthony a monster and a murderer. The way that he says murderer is so drenched in just like hate. I love that kind of that tone that he gives to that one word, like, you're a murderer. I can't do it. Anyway, and there's like kind of a certain nobility to Dan standing up to evil in that way. Cause I mean, Anthony is a monster. He's a monster. He's evil. And then he starts to plead for someone to stand up and end it. And he's saying that like someone in this room needs to pick up something heavy and bash his fucking head in. He doesn't say that, but level Anthony with it and end all of this. And we see Amy start to grab a weapon from the fireplace, but she stops. Presumably she can't bring herself to do it, or she doesn't have kind of the balls to do it. And that's such an interesting thought. Like the idea that all of these adults are under siege by Anthony Fremont, and the idea that an adult can plead with the other adults in the room, like, hey, I'm about to be murdered. Please, someone kill the 6-year-old kid in front of me. That is like, even with him being a monster and everything, that is just, man, it's dark, and you really, I don't know. It's unsettling, for sure. And so that's when Anthony says, you're a bad man. You're a very bad man. And, that's when he turns him into the Jack-in-the-Box, which that was so cool. That was so cool. And again, the effective way that it's shot is so cool, because we just see the shadow of it swaying back and forth. And then we get like one like insert shot of Dan from the chest up swaying as well. And it's like, that's such an effective way to demonstrate this really, really unsettling, like crazy development in the story. And so Mr. Fremont goes up to Anthony, puts his arm around him and says, wish him into the cornfield. Please just wish him into the cornfield, which again, like Mr. Fremont is a more kind of, I don't know, gentle, I guess, presence toward Anthony. And this is an interesting, like, call for mercy from Mr. Fremont. Like, he's like, please just essentially saying like, please mercy kill this man, send him to the cornfield, kill him so that he doesn't have to be a fucking Jack-in-the-Box. It's like, it's so, it's weirdly a nice moment, but it's also just disturbing. And the way that Anthony nods his head at Mr. Fremont, at his dad, is like, so, again, it's kind of an unsettling thing, because it's as if this monster is granting a wish. He's like, yes, you've done good, father. You're one of my subjects, and I'm a benevolent king. Like, you can show that I'm actually a good person, because I'm going to mercy kill this neighbor on his birthday. And it's like there's so much to that I just think is really interesting. And so after he sends him to the cornfield, Anthony says he's a bad man, and then he looks over at Ethel and says, and don't you think bad thoughts about me, or I'll do that to you too, or whatever. And then he commands Pat to play more music. And that, man, that moment, it's like, this is where Anthony he's angry. He's actually, it's not this chaotic thing. It's this pointed anger, which makes it seem so much more threatening and in such a significant way, as opposed to earlier in the episode when it's more walking on pins and needles and trying not to say the wrong thing. Like, this is him harnessing like his power within the community. And it's him at his most frightening. And it seems he's more aware of his power over the adults than he was previously. And of course, all the adults are like, oh, it was good what you did. That was a good thing. It was good. And then Amy walks over to the couch and she sits down and she's like, oh, I liked it better when there were other cities and television and everything. And that's when Mrs. Fremont rushes over to her and reassures her that, no, everything is good. And then Mr. Fremont backs her up by saying, oh, it's the best TV we've ever seen. Which, again, the true monster is that Anthony is a TV executive. Anyway, then like that scene of them reassuring Amy or correcting Amy so that she doesn't get, murdered, is another, this creates this closed loop, or closed loop, in the story, in that nothing changes. Nothing has changed in this. And that is very disturbing, because Anthony wins. He doesn't have like a comeuppance. He doesn't have any, there's no retribution or any kind of consequence. And that is by itself very frightening and in a really good way to end the episode. And that shot of him sitting on the chair with his fist on his chin and he's smiling is just so creepy because he's like so satisfied with himself. And then he starts to make it snow. And I really like John Larch, his performance in this episode. But when he's as Mr. Fremont, he's like, Anthony, are you making it snow? And then he has like this brief break in his demeanor where he says yes, and then he's like, oh, you'll ruin half the crops and everything. And then he has to stop. It's like, tomorrow's going to be a really good day. Tomorrow's going to be a real good day. And I love that. It's the briefest thing from this more stoic presence or this more controlled presence throughout the episode, but nothing changes. Anthony's still in control, and it is still, Peaksville is still under siege by a monster. And that's the end of the episode. And it's so satisfying. And I'm going to play the closing narration from Rod Serling right now.
No comment here. No comment at all. We only wanted to introduce you to one of our very special citizens, little Anthony Fremont, age 6, who lives in a village called Peaksville, in a place that used to be Ohio. And if by some strange chance you should run across him, you had best think only good thoughts. Anything less than that is handled at your own risk. Because if you do meet Anthony, you can be sure of one thing. You have entered the Twilight Zone.
So overall, I think this is a fantastic episode. And I love how it's, like I said, this kind of self-contained, standalone kind of demonstration of a group of people under siege by a monster. And it's this closed loop story where nothing changes. There's no resolution to the monstrosity at play in Peaksville. And I'm kind of curious how that's going to come into play in the sequel episode that I'm going to review in just a few short minutes for you, but probably a few hours, or I don't know, maybe a day or so. I don't know. I'm recording this pretty good in advance. Anyway, so trivia for this episode. So overall, really love the episode. Really thought it was great. Bill Mumy is fantastic. And I really enjoyed this episode. So trivia for this episode, I've kind of collected some trivia. It contains the longest opening narration of any segment of any Twilight Zone series, which is kind of a given. And the word good is repeated in the episode 46 times. And I've seen this episode probably 5 or 6 times. I've listened to it twice, I think, while I was working. And so I've heard the word good in this episode incalculable amount of times. It is very calculable, but it is also 2:30 a.m. while I'm recording this. So, this episode was named the 3rd best Twilight Zone episode by Time magazine. It came in behind Time Enough at Last and The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. I don't know where I would rank it in terms of the episodes that I've seen, but I would definitely put it below Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, Obsolete Man, of course. But it is a very, it's a top tier Twilight Zone episode for sure. And I would rank it pretty high. Maybe someday I'll do a ranking of all the episodes, but for now, I would rank it pretty high. Rod Serling's next piece of trivia is that Rod Serling's introduction at the beginning of the episode was actually recycled and digitally edited for the pre-show video of the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror at, I think it was Disneyland, right? So in the pre-show video, Serling stands in front of a service elevator door instead of a map, and he explains to guests the journey they're about to experience. And let's see. So the trivia goes into detail. It says that the Disney MGM Studios, it first opened at Disney MGM Studios in 1994, which was almost 2 decades after Serling's death. And so then that's when they brought in Mark Silverman, who was personally chosen by Serling's widow to provide his voice for the attraction. And I actually have a clip of the a brief clip of that. So here is a clip from the Tower of Terror with Mark Silverman doing his vocal work for Serling.
The time is now, on an evening very much like the one we have just witnessed. Tonight's story on the Twilight Zone is somewhat unique and calls for a different kind of introduction. This, as you may recognize, is a maintenance service elevator, still in operation, waiting for you. We invite you, if you dare, to step aboard, because in tonight's episode, you are the star. And this elevator travels directly to the Twilight Zone.
I'm so bummed that I never got a chance to experience the Tower of Terror in the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, because now it's like Guardians of the Galaxy themed, I think. I don't know. I've never been to Disney. Well, I've been to Disney World, but I was a kid. But I'm kind of bummed that I never got a chance to experience that. I did go on the Outer Limits ride at Kings Island when it was the Outer Limits, and it destroyed my stomach that day. So additional trivia is that in 1997, TV Guide ranked this episode number 31 on its 100 greatest episodes of all time list, which is incredible. And also, this is a significant bummer. But in 1974, in an interview with Marvel Comics, Rod Serling said, quote, "I'm on my third draft of a feature film based on Jerome Bixby's short story, It's a Good Life. We did it originally on Twilight Zone, but now we're doing a full-length version. Alan Landsberg, who produced Chariots of the Gods, is producing it. It's in the fantasy horror genre." And according to the trivia, this was one of Serling's last interviews before his death in 1975. So obviously the feature film was never made, but man, what could have been? That would have been interesting to see. And of course, the Twilight Zone movie did remake this episode in a segment in the movie, which was that segment was directed by Joe Dante. And like I said early in the episode, I was really conflicted about whether or not I should have covered the Twilight Zone movie here, but ultimately decided not to, since I know it also has a remake of Kick the Can, which is an episode I haven't seen yet. And also chronologically, I just feel more comfortable covering the movie after I finish the original series, whenever that may be, because I've been doing this for, I think, 5 years, with all the stops and starts and everything. And I'm almost halfway through the entire series. So we'll see what happens in 2026. So a couple other kind of pieces of trivia before I wrap up this section of the episode, but the Omen series, I don't know if it necessarily is influenced by this directly, or if it's just a kind of a happy coincidence, but in the Omen series, the Antichrist, Damien, is a child who has supernatural powers similar to Anthony Fremont in this episode. And of course, this episode, as I mentioned before, was remade as a parody in the episode of The Simpsons, Treehouse of Horror 2 in 1991. And here's a nice little kind of Tower Junkies connection. Check out my Stephen King podcast, Tower Junkies, at towerjunkiespod.com. But this episode is evoked in Stephen King's novel, The Regulators, from 1996. That was one of his books he wrote under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman. But anyway, apparently I haven't read that book yet. But in it, an alien entity with psychic powers possesses a young child and uses his abilities to terrorize the folks of a small town. From what I can glean without, I'm reading my notes because I just copied and pasted from trivia, and I'm reading it without trying to navigate it without having any spoilers for The Regulators, because it's obviously on my list since I have a podcast that covers Stephen King. So that's my review of It's a Good Life. And man, this was quite an episode. Can't wait to continue recording this episode and review the season, or the 2002 remake or sequel, It's Still a Good Life. So yeah, that's it for this section of the episode. I don't have any music queued up or anything. So yeah, here in a couple seconds, I'm going to come back and review It's Still a Good Life, because I still need to listen to it. And I'll just play a little bit of music to transition into that section.
You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are only that of the imagination. You're entering the Twilight Zone.
And I'm back. So I know that little interlude with the 2002 Twilight Zone theme music probably felt like an eternity before I get to this bonus review. But you might say it may have sounded, or may have felt like a week had passed, because that's how much time has passed since I recorded that first segment. Anyway, so to round out this episode of Anthology, I'm going to review the sequel to It's a Good Life from 2002's Twilight Zone reboot on UPN. It's still a good life. It aired on February 19th, 2003, and the synopsis, according to IMDb, is 40 years later, godlike Anthony Fremont is still holding Peaksville, Ohio under a reign of terror. However, there are things about to change when his daughter turns out to have similar powers. So this episode stars Bill Mumy as Anthony Fremont and Cloris Leachman as Agnes Fremont, reprising their roles from the 1961 episode of the original series. And co-starring as Audrey, Anthony's daughter, is Bill Mumy's real-life daughter, Liliana Mumy. She has numerous voice credits to her career, including roles in Nickelodeon's The Loud House, and she also appeared in The Santa Claus 2 and The Santa Claus 3, and Cheaper by the Dozen and its sequel. Writer for this episode was Ira Stephen Bear, who has a long and storied history in science fiction. He was the writer and executive producer of Outlander, Alphas, the 4400, Star Trek The Next Generation, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And he's going to be the executive producer and one of the writers for Beacon 23, which is a science fiction drama based on a book of the same name by best-selling author Hugh Howey. The plot synopsis of that is: a man living in the 23rd century works at a remote lighthouse in space that serves as a beacon to help passing ships. Lena Headey from Game of Thrones is set to star and also executive produce that show. And director for this episode was Alan Croker. He directed one episode of the 1980s Twilight Zone, titled Something in the Walls in 1989, and he also directed 2 additional episodes of this iteration of the Twilight Zone. And he also has a fair amount of directorial credits under his belt. He directed episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, Andromeda, Roswell, and Battlestar Galactica. So, okay. So I'm going to go into my review. Unlike my science fiction theater review, bonus reviews and everything, I'm going to go ahead and spoil this episode of the 2002 Twilight Zone. So if you haven't seen this episode, go seek it out. I do believe that it is available in its entirety on YouTube for free. So go ahead and check that out and then come back and listen to this review. Okay, so instead of doing my kind of overall feelings and everything, I'm going to go ahead and talk about my expectations going into this episode before I watched it. Because like I said, I watched this after recording my review of the original episode, so I had no idea what to expect in terms of what I would go into with this episode. So, first of all, I was extremely curious about how a sequel to It's a Good Life would play out. And I was wondering if it would catch up with Anthony as an adult monster, or if it would be about him reckoning with his actions that he took as a child. Like, was there going to be a plot line of him coming to terms with the monster that he was as a child and kind of figuring out that what he was doing was wrong? Or is he just going to be a grown-up monster? So that was kind of the big thing between the two the two ideas that I kind of wrestled with in terms of what I thought I might expect from a sequel episode to It's a Good Life. In addition to that, I did wonder if there was going to be another child with the power in the town now. So knowing that this episode picks up from It's a Good Life 40 years later, I kind of wondered if maybe Anthony would be on the receiving end of a new child with special powers. And it never occurred to me that the child would be his daughter. And I never expected him to have that kind of conflict. So I was pleasantly surprised by this episode. And I just really going into it, I just thought there are a lot of possibilities here. And I did make a note. I said to myself that I need to try to keep my expectations sort of low, given that this was the 2002 Twilight Zone, which I've seen a few episodes from this series. It's not terrible. Like, it's really not that terrible. But I watched these episodes in the shadow of the original series, and they come across as pretty rough in that context. So I kind of wanted to try to keep an open mind for myself as I went into It's Still a Good Life. And right off the bat, much like the original series, we get opening narration / an introduction by host Forrest Whitaker in this iteration. So much like the original episode, I'm going to go ahead and play the opening narration. This is your final warning. I'm going to go into full spoilers here. So I'm going to play the opening narration, and then it's spoilers on for It's Still a Good Life.
40 years ago, Rod Serling introduced us to a monster. A monster so powerful he was able to make the world disappear just by using his mind. For the residents of Peaksville, Ohio, a nightmare had begun. The monster knew their every thought, could feel their every emotion, and when they made him angry, which was often, he would banish them into a cornfield from which there was no return. And the most frightening thing about this monster was that he was only 6 years old. Now, it's 40 years later, and the people of Peaksville are still in hell. Oh yes, there's one other thing. The monster now has a child of his own. And though she possesses none of her father's powers, he still loves her very, very much. Okay, so first of all, I just noticed that it's a much bigger map of the United States than what we saw in the original series. It's much bigger and obviously colorful. And it opens with Forrest Whitaker talking about the original episode. Kind of, out of, I guess, breaking the fourth wall, referring to it as like, Rod Serling introduced us to a monster 40 years ago. And I thought that was kind of an interesting tactic, kind of showcasing the, what's the word? The legacy of the Twilight Zone as a property, rather than saying that 40 years ago in the Twilight Zone, this thing happened, and now we're going to pick up with it 40 years later. Instead, it's like 40 years ago, there was a TV show that had this episode about these people. Now let's pick up with them 40 years later. So I thought that was kind of interesting and kind of honors the legacy of the original series. However, partway through this introduction, when he refers to Anthony and talks about the monster and everything being a 6-year-old boy, we see this shot, a shot of Anthony from the original episode. It's him on the little fence door thing from the original episode. And that kind of felt a little bit like a cheesy documentary about the episode to me. Like just that kind of general aesthetic kind of felt like it was a little bit hokey to me. So I don't know. I mean, it wasn't too bad or anything, but it kind of took me out of it just slightly, because it made me think, well, okay, yeah. I mean, I've seen this episode. Like it feels like a clip show from the original series, in terms of maybe a documentary about the show. I don't know, but it was very brief and it was fine. But the other thing that he says in it is that the people of Peaksville are still in hell. And that was a big kind of confirmation for me, because I was wondering if it would be a story about him reckoning with his past or with Anthony still controlling Peaksville. And I got my answer right off the bat, and that was really interesting. The final thing that he says, which I thought was a very nice homage in an episode that has several of them throughout, he says, and there's one more thing. Anthony now has a child of his own, and she doesn't have his powers, but he loves her very, very much. And just the fact that the writing of it is playing up the, or paying homage to Serling is just really nice when he says, and there's one other thing. That just feels, cause that just feels so nice, cause it's a callback to Rod Serling saying like, I forgot to mention something. The monster is a 6-year-old boy. So I don't know. It's just, I love that both these episodes have this, have this vital piece of information held back and given to us in the dialogue or in the monologue, as almost, maybe not as an afterthought, but as something close to an afterthought, or something that was maybe a little bit close to being forgotten. And I just really like that as an homage. Yeah. So, all right, so let's do this. So we go into the episode, and Audrey is Anthony's daughter. She is playing on a tree with her friend Timmy, and they're talking, and she mentions that you can see the whole world from there. Or I think Timmy does. I don't remember. But anyway, and I thought that was kind of nice because it was, confirmation again that the world has still disappeared. And they even say like, well, we can only see to the highway. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the whole world. And kind of a little messed up. So Timmy doesn't want to play anymore, so he pulls her arm and she falls from the tree. And so this is like a big shocking moment. And we get a shot of Cloris Leachman and Bill Mumy in the house. And we see Anthony playing piano with his mind while Agnes hears Audrey's scream. And she jumps up and runs out there. And so when we pick up with that scene, Anthony is walking outside and he sees Agnes holding Audrey and walking toward like the lawn. And she says, "I've told you time and time again not to climb that tree." And then, before that, she says, "You don't want your father hearing you screaming." And then she says, "I've told you time and time again not to climb that tree." And then she looks at Anthony and says, "Oh, hey, you took a few spills from those branches when you were little, Anthony, you remember?" And I was really, really impressed with this dialogue and this whole sequence here, because it just immediately tells us so much in subtext about the state of Peaksville 40 years after It's a Good Life. Because Agnes telling Audrey that she doesn't want her father to hear her screaming is a subtle kind of a warning that like, oh, hey, we don't need to incur your father's wrath, so please shut up. And then immediately after that, when she says, "I told you time and time again not to climb that tree," that seems like it is kind of coded in a little bit. It seems like she is saying it within earshot of Anthony so that he, as kind of a subtle form of manipulation, saying that like, well, just kind of abstractly signaling to him that, oh, it wasn't this innocent boy's fault that was playing with your daughter. It was your daughter. I told her not to climb the tree. She climbed the tree. She fell down as a result of her climbing the tree. And so that just feels like it's just layered with this subtle feeling of, I don't want to get this kid killed, so let's make sure that my monster of a son thinks that his daughter is responsible for the injury that she does. And it's also another layer to that is it's also that she is just immediately trying to diffuse the situation by putting blame on Audrey and then trying to explain to Anthony that the same thing happened to him on multiple occasions when he was a kid. Just diffusing it and just making it seem like, oh, this is a normal occurrence. This is fine. There's no reason to incur your wrath. And I just feel like this is such a good way to demonstrate how fully ingrained Anthony's power over everyone is and still is in Peaksville. It's very good dialogue, just very quick and clean dialogue there. And then to kind of double down on Agnes's her whole kind of wanting to diffuse the situation, Audrey begs Anthony not to hurt Timmy. And Anthony looks at her and says, I won't hurt your friend. He's always had good thoughts about us. And so that was nice. It's a nice diffused situation. And then George comes up. George is Timmy's father, and he comes to pick Timmy up. And again, this may be a looser kind of connection to the original episode, but I really like that this kind of mirrors the original episode in a way, because Timmy's father, George, is the first adult to come to the house, aside from Agnes and Anthony. But he's, for all intents and purposes, the first adult that arrives on the scene. And he's on a bike. And in the original episode, Bill is the first adult to come to the house, and he rides a bike to the house with the delivery of the goods from the store. And that could be completely unintentional since there's no electricity, so obviously everyone's going to be riding bikes and everything. But I think that there's enough there that it could be an intentional reference, and I really appreciate it for that. Just in terms of just having a nice little homage to the original episode, which this episode is rife with. And so Anthony approaches George, and he becomes defensive and threatening. He says, "What kind of a boy pushes a little girl out of a tree?" And then he kind of just keeps egging him on and says, "I thought you were my friend." And he's like, "I am your friend. I'm sorry. I am your friend." And then Anthony says, "I've been around people like you all my life. People who pretend to be my friend, pretend to like me." And before we get to what he does to George, I just want to say that's very interesting. So it shows that he hasn't changed at all. And it's also an interesting wrinkle to the story of Anthony Fremont, because in the original episode, he's a 6-year-old kid. He's a petulant child with godlike abilities. And now you can kind of chart this next stage of his life, 40 years in the future, as an adult with his own kid, to being him becoming this paranoid narcissist, just evil person. And like, he's the god of Peaksville, but he's also paranoid of everyone's intentions and everyone's thoughts and everyone's actions against him and everything. And it's so interesting to me, the growth of the Anthony Fremont character between these two episodes. And then he sets George on fire. And man, okay. So he sets George on fire. The man is literally burning alive in front of everyone, in front of his kid. And then Agnes begs Anthony to send him into the cornfield. And he does. And on one hand, I love that as a reference and homage to the original episode on two fronts. So in the original episode, Anthony refers to a neighbor that he set on fire because he didn't like him or anything. And I mentioned in my review, like 20 minutes ago or a week ago, that was chilling. That was one of the most disturbing scenes of the original series episode because of just how relaxed he was and how casual he was about this. So actually showing it happen, though, as opposed to hearing a little kid mention it offhand, it doesn't necessarily have that same chilling effect to me, but it's still pretty intense nonetheless, because by all intents and purposes, Anthony Fremont is 46 years old now, and he should know that he should have developed empathy and just genuine, like, goodness and in some capacity, but he didn't. Like, he's still willing to set a father on fire for the sole reason that he thought bad thoughts about him. And so that's the one prong of the two-pronged homage that we had in this scene. The second being Agnes begging Anthony to send George into the cornfield. It's just like his father did with was it Dan Hollis being the Jack in the Box. And I just love how that mirrors it. Like, now his mother is telling him to send someone into the cornfield, just as his father did 40 years earlier. I thought that was really cool. And so Timmy's reaction to watching his dad burn alive and then disappear into a cornfield that no one knows what it's like there is disturbing and tragic and horrifying and sad. He just calls for his dad. He says "Daddy" a couple of times, and it's just really, really messed up. And all Anthony says is, you should run home to your mom, and just very cold and very just monstrous. I mean, he's a monster. It's incredible. So then we get to the next scene, and Audrey is inside with Agnes, and Audrey's upset. She's upset because now Timmy's never going to play with her again. And at this point, I was like, I wonder what happened to her mother. Like, I kind of wonder where Anthony Fremont's wife or girlfriend or baby mama is. And I kind of had some ideas where she would end up being, but we'll get to that in a bit. Actually, in a couple minutes, I think. But anyway, Cloris Leachman, as Agnes, reminds Audrey that she needs to mask her negative thoughts. And she talks about how she has explained to her before, like, you need to mask your thoughts, like your negative thoughts, so that your father can't hear them or anything. And that is just such an interesting piece of world building and exposition and catch up. Because it's just explaining to the audience that Agnes and presumably other people from Peaksville have been developing tools, like mental tools, to combat Anthony's power once again, or to combat Anthony's power, which also once again shows how ingrained his hold on the town is. It's just really interesting pieces of just information that's given to us throughout the episode. And so Audrey gets angry and still becomes more angry, and she breaks the framed picture of Mr. and Mrs. Fremont with magic powers. And that's when we get the reveal that Audrey has powers, and that's when we get our opening theme music break for this episode of The Twilight Zone 2002. So once we come back, we see Agnes talking to Audrey, asking if that was the first time she's ever used powers. And Audrey reveals that Anthony can't read her thoughts in that scene. And I thought that was a really interesting spin on what's established in the original. Because the fact that she can't read, the fact that he can't read her thoughts is just an interesting kind of wrinkle to bring into it. And Agnes asks, like, how do you know that? And she says, because I can read his, which that is a kind of just disturbing revelation, or a really interesting revelation to it, which I kind of think would have been served a little bit better if it had better payoff, like that she can read his mind and then sends him to the cornfield. That would have been an interesting ending. Damn. Yeah, I kind of think I would have preferred that to what we got at the end. I'll get to that in a bit, but man, that would have been interesting. Anyway, so what I find really interesting is that the episodes from the 2002 series, like I said before, that I've seen all come across as a bit too cheesy for my liking, but there's something to this episode. This episode seems to have been handled with a certain level of reverence toward the original that I don't know is necessarily present in those other episodes that I've watched. Granted, it's been a little while since I've seen any of the other episodes from 2002. And I mean, that was after watching, like I watched The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street's remake. After watching The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which I loved The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, so I was already kind of at a disadvantage watching the 2002 remake. And then also, the other one was Eye of the Beholder, which is, I mean, that is a just massive episode from the original series. So, I don't know, I guess the 2002 series is at a little bit of a disadvantage in my eyes. But this episode really worked for me because it has all of these callbacks to the original episode and all of these updates, and it really kind of seems to revere everything about that original episode and really does take care to update it and fill us in on what's going on in Peaksville 40 years later. I thought it's really cool. And so on that similar note, the next scene has Audrey asking Anthony about the cornfield, asking what it is, where he sends the people, and all of that. And this I got a little bit nervous about because one of the really cool things about the original episode is that it does not reveal any information about the cornfield. It is just this abstract place where he sends people, presumably to murder them and have them die. And we don't get any information about that. We don't get any information about what it's like there, or if it's just an instant death thing. We get nothing. And so what I was nervous about was that Audrey was asking Anthony about the cornfield, and I was very nervous that this episode was going to reveal too much or reveal anything about the cornfield, because that is such an instrumental part to the terror and the horror of the original episode that to retroactively give us an explanation or give us a view of the cornfield would potentially damage that original episode. So, fortunately, I have nothing to worry about because they keep it ambiguous, and I really love it for that. And also, another thing that I kind of, one thing that I do kind of like about this line of questioning that Audrey has toward Anthony is that in this scene, Audrey kind of becomes the audience surrogate. Like 40 years worth of audience surrogacy is in this one scene where for 40 years people have been asking, wait, what's in the cornfield? Like, what? I want information about the cornfield. And so Audrey in the sequel episode is just asking him point blank, hey, what's the cornfield? I kind of like that as kind of a meta kind of thing. I really appreciated that. And also, again, it was such a relief that the show continued to conceal the true nature of the cornfield. That was a huge, huge relief to me. Now, what Anthony actually says in response to Audrey is that the people who are there are happy all the time. And when she asks if he can bring someone back or bring Timmy's dad back so that Timmy can play with her again, he says, once I send something away, I can't bring it back. And I thought that was really interesting because I know that it's not just people that he sends to the cornfield. He sends away watches and electronics and automobiles. He sends away dogs. He sends away everything. But what I find really interesting is that in this response, he says, once I sent something away, I can't bring it back. And I read that as this sociopath, just evil person who does not consider the people that he murders as people. Like, he is trying to justify saying that the people are happy all the time. It's a happy place where I can't hurt them anymore. But he doesn't even consider them people because he refers to them as something and it. And I thought that was a really, really cool window into Anthony's kind of mental state and his reality. And so after that, this is a brisk episode. Like, it's a brisk kind of scene by scene thing. So it doesn't really transition that well. But anyway, we see Agnes and Audrey going up to their neighbor Lorna, and Lorna is farming her land, and she offers tomatoes for Anthony because Anthony loves tomatoes and everything. And again, this is a nice little callback to Bill in the original series episode, talking about like, oh, won't you tell him that I got him some, I think it was tomato soup actually, tomato soup. And I just know he loves tomato soup, and will you tell him that it was from me? And this is a nice like mirror to that. Again, a lot of fun callbacks to the original episode. So at this moment, Agnes shows Lorna Audrey's powers. She has Audrey remove a big rock from the land, and Lorna is extremely happy about this. She and Agnes talk about how Audrey is probably the key to finally getting rid of Anthony. And man, so Cloris Leachman is phenomenal. Like, rest in peace and everything. She was phenomenal. In this episode was a really cool way to bring her back into the Twilight Zone-verse. Because here we have Agnes kind of lower the guard that she has toward Anthony and talk about the hope that she has for ending the madness. So she refers to him as the monster that she gave birth to. And I love that. Because she finishes Lorna's train of thought and says like, oh, he's the monster that I gave birth to. And I feel like that's like a 40-year extension of that moment in the original episode where she wished the monster, she wished that the monster that he made the other day would have bitten him as a child. And where she just stops just short of that. But now it's been 40 years later. It's been 40 years in the making. She's like, no, I'm just going to outright say it. He's a monster that I gave birth to. And then she delivers in this moment a little bit of backstory to bring us up to speed. She reveals that Anthony sent his father into the cornfield and also sent Anthony's own wife into the cornfield. And I felt kind of bummed when I found out that his father was sent into the cornfield. But it makes sense though, because it's a nice like connective thing from the original episode, because that original episode ends with ends with Mr. Fremont kind of having just that minor like break, saying like, "Oh, you're going to ruin half the crops," and then he stops short. So it's like you see that little slip up and everything. Not to say that Anthony sent him to the cornfield because of that, but it's just showing that in that moment he has less patience toward him. So that's kind of this foreshadowing thing that, oh, eventually he's going to get sent to the cornfield because he isn't going to be able to hold back his anger and his frustration with his son. And so Agnes in this episode then says, "If only I'd been strong enough and brave enough to bash his head in years ago," which, man, that again, it's kind of it's a strong extension of that scene in the original episode, but it's also just so tragic and kind of badass also. Because Agnes she's not having it anymore. It's been 40 years. She's lost everything. And she is now on the side of like wanting Anthony to be done. She wants to get rid of him and like avenge her town and her loved ones and the world. Which that's not going to be the first Avengers reference that I make here, because this episode goes into some interesting places that I correlate to my modern day fandoms and everything. So hold on tight for that. So Lorna says, like, "Are you sure that Audrey's going to be ready?" And Agnes says that she's going to make sure that Audrey is ready to end Anthony. And so that I thought was an interesting angle again, and a very interesting way to bring us this to bring us into this kind of plot line that I don't feel really gets resolved that well. Like this idea that Agnes is going to either train or manipulate, or she is going to fight for control of her granddaughter over the control that her son has over her. I think that is very interesting. And with the time frame of this episode, they don't have a lot of time to explore that at all. And that's a shame, because I kind of wish it would have been a little bit better to see Agnes kind of trying to figure out like a way to convince Audrey to murder her father. Like, that is so incredibly dark. And as I'm saying these words out loud, I'm wondering how it could have been, like what could have been if they would have made the movie that Rod Serling was working on. I don't know. I have no idea if Rod Serling was thinking about running it up to, the future or anything like that. But I think that there could be an interesting storyline displayed here where it maybe merges the two timelines of the two episodes and creates this feature-length thing where Agnes is having to like train her granddaughter to murder her, to murder Anthony and everything. After the first act or first half of the movie is about Anthony as a child, as a monster. That would be such an interesting movie. But I don't know, maybe someday. So anyway, then we get Bowling Night, which is kind of an interesting callback to TV Night from the original episode. And it's just filled with more and more adulation for Anthony. And it's kind of eerie. It's not quite as atmospherically creepy as the original episode was, but it is creepy in its own right to see him bowling alone and then everyone in town behind him cheering and everything. It's a very eerie kind of creepy setup and everything. So he sits down and he is talking to Agnes. Agnes is congratulating him, saying like, "Oh, you've got like 600 perfect games and everything." Which, God, it's so creepy. It's so creepy. Just this town being under the thumb of this monster is just so unsettling and so unnerving to me. And she mentions something. She says something like, "Oh, freckles" or something, and then she says, "It serves me right. I never had the courage to punish you or anything." I don't remember exactly what the context was, but then he says, "Punish me for what?" And man, that was so cool, and another fun little peek into the window of Anthony's just monstrosity of a soul, because he has no sense of what he's done. He has no sense of what he is, and he has no conscience for his actions. And that is such a creepy, just undercurrent of danger present in this episode. It's really, really cool. So so I kind of wonder, briefly, I wondered if that would really track, because it just seemed like, on the surface, it kind of seems like he is just an extension of 6-year-old Anthony, and it kind of seems maybe it's a little bit lazy to just have him be the exact same as he was as a kid in the sequel. It kind of seems maybe a little bit crowd pleasy or fan servicey, instead, in lieu of actually having him develop into have any kind of characterization between the episodes. But I think this actually makes a lot of sense, because as a kid, if he's a god and he can't be taught and disciplined as a child, he wouldn't learn anything anyway. And so he wouldn't be able to, like, it's not like he would grow out of this thing when everyone is just constantly raining adulation toward him, and him knowing that he has this power to get rid of anything he doesn't like. I mean, there's no reason for him to grow out of that, because he is a god of Peaksville. And so, but the thing that I find interesting is him as an adult is more suspicious and more paranoid, and I really like that wrinkle to his character. So he becomes suspicious as everyone around him is cheering him on and everything, and they seem a little distracted because Lorna has told some others about Audrey's powers, and he becomes suspicious. And Agnes says that they're all thinking good thoughts. And I love that also because it comes across as it is undoubtedly meant to come across as her trying to control a monster, which is something she's been doing for 40 years. And it's just, it's really, really good, just quick writing there. And so Agnes approaches Lorna and tells her, like, what are you doing? You can't tell anyone. We can't let Anthony know that Audrey has powers, not yet. And Lorna says that she just wanted to give the others hope, because hope is something that they haven't had in decades. Like, they've never had hope. And like, I like that, because we don't get a lot of the kind of greater Peaksville community in this episode, which I could kind of take or leave. But what we do get here is just this very small, like, scene where it's just explaining just so much in one little line of dialogue about the kind of state of the town and the community that's still, after all this time, still under siege by Anthony Fremont. And so Anthony's getting kind of bored, and he has someone bowl against him. And the guy, I think his name was either Jim or Joe, or Joseph, but dude is terrified, and he is throwing gutter balls and everything. And Anthony, then he throws one gutter ball, and then Anthony picks up another ball and kind of pushes it into his chest and he tells him in this very chilling way, like Bill Mumy does a fantastic job in this episode, just showing how creepy and unsettling Anthony Fremont as an adult is. So he shoves the ball into the guy's chest and he says, concentrate. And he does this in such a vaguely threatening manner. And it's so chilling knowing what he can do and knowing what he is capable of. And so the guy throws another gutter ball, and Anthony kind of goes a little bit off. He wants someone to at least try. He wants the guy to at least try to beat him. And Agnes says, like, well, everyone knows that you're the best bowler in the whole town. And then he's like, well, I just want someone to at least try, because I that would make me happy. Don't you want me to be happy like everybody else? And man, that's so creepy. That is so, because you can feel the anger rising in him as he is escalating this. And then he confronts the bowler, and it seems like he's about to, send him to the cornfield, or I don't know, turn him into a ball polisher or something. Not a euphemism, but anyway. But then Audrey interrupts and asks Anthony to play the pinball machine with her. And that was really cool because Anthony, that is Anthony's kryptonite. That is Anthony's just, okay, I'm going to switch gears and be a father now. Because he's like, okay, well, yeah, that's a good idea. And he says, you're a good girl, Audrey. Isn't she a real good girl? Which, again, another fun kind of reference or homage to the original series episode. Kind of the inverse of that. So then they leave, and then we get a scene with Anthony confronting Lorna in her garden. And the scene plays out like a serial killer stalking someone, or like a scene where a confidant is about to murder someone. And we don't get a lot there. I do like that that she's talking to the tomatoes, and she says, like, do you want to know a secret? And then you just hear Anthony say, I don't like secrets. Just really creepy. And the scene ends with the assumption that he's killed her, but we won't know for sure until the town hall meeting. Again, really brief scene, very brisk episode that the scenes are kind of cut a little bit short here and there, without much connective tissue, which is, it's a pacing thing. I think it would have worked better if it was a little bit less stitched together that way, but we do get a lot of information in the episode, so I mean, I can kind of take or leave it. So, we see Agnes spending time with Audrey, showing her a photo album. We see pictures of Mr. Fremont, and that's kind of nice. And Agnes is telling Audrey about like their trip to New York and how there were so many cars and how it was such a big sprawling city and everything. And then I think she mentions the watch in the picture, and Audrey asks why no one has watches anymore. And Agnes says, well, one day Anthony was late for dinner and I guess I just forgot, and I just showed him the time to show that he was late for dinner, and then he took away all watches, which is such a petulant thing to do, I guess. And then we get the big moment of the episode. Audrey brings back Agnes's watch with the inscription and everything, and it's a really big revelation of this episode that she can bring things back from places that Anthony sent them. And at that moment, I was like, this could be really interesting, and it feels like could be like the inverse of the original episode. Instead of the episode being about the threat of people being taken away and things being taken away to the cornfield, it's about things coming back and everything. And then I have in my notes, is this the Avengers Endgame of Twilight Zone episodes? Which it kind of is. So that's all I'll say about that. So anyway, Anthony comes in and he is obviously perturbed, and he says that people have been keeping secrets from him about his daughter. And that's when, like, it kind of, the tension gets heightened a little bit and ratchets up a little bit. And instead of Anthony confronting Agnes and confronting Audrey about it, he asks Audrey to send the photo album away. Because he knows that she has powers, because he got that information from Lorna, presumably. And what I love, or what I found really kind of cruel and sad, was that he looks at Agnes and says, Mom, it's okay if Audrey sends the photo album away, right? And Agnes just kind of is a little defeated, and she's like, yes, it's fine. It's just old things. It doesn't matter or anything. And I just found just a certain level of cruelty in that on Anthony's part, because that photo album is presumably her last link to what the world was before. And that is just so tragic to me, and so just sad that he is, out of anger and out of spite and out of, I don't know, just his monstrous energy, he is going to take this thing away from his mother as punishment for perceived injustice that he has suffered, even though he is a monster. So Audrey complies and takes the photo album away, and she asks Anthony if he's mad, and he says, no, you're special like me. And so he ends the scene by saying that he's going to call a town hall meeting, and Agnes says, about what? And as he's walking away, he says, that's my secret. And man, I really, really like Bill Mooney's intensity in this episode. Like, he really has this control over each scene that comes across as this controlled intensity that I think just really, really works. Like, he does a fantastic job just channeling this monster that he played 40 years earlier in this new episode is really cool to me. So we get to the town hall meeting, and Agnes approaches Lorna, who is non-responsive and catatonic. And again, nice callback and homage to the original episode with Aunt Amy. And Anthony kind of comes up behind her and says, I had to punish her. She was sneaky. I don't like sneaky people. And just that is just so, oh man, it's just so creepy and unsettling. So he kicks off the meeting by saying that Peaksville is full of sneaky people. And he says that he's going to send people away to set an example. And he starts counting off people. I think the first one is the bowler. He's like, oh, you can be the first one. And then the woman next to you, you can be the next one. And you can be the third one. And you can be the fourth one. And And again, I was very nervous that they were going to explain the cornfield in this scene. Like I was very nervous that they were going to kind of reveal that magic trick, but they didn't, and thank God they didn't, because it works so much better as this ambiguous entity in the Twilight Zone universe. And so here is where we get Agnes kind of becoming the Dan Hollis of this episode. She stands up to Anthony, and it is awesome. Cloris Leachman nails this scene so freaking hard. She just has this outburst, and then Anthony says, "You love me," or he says something like, "You love me, don't you?" And then she says, "Love you? I curse the day I gave birth to you." And she talks about how every night she lays awake and tries to think of ways to put an end to all of this. And then we get such a cool callback, because she says, "You know why, Anthony? Because you're a bad man, a very bad man." And I love it so much. I love that so much. And that's when Agnes commands Audrey to wish Anthony away. And this is like the pivotal moment, the climactic moment of the episode. And Audrey hesitates. And then someone comes up behind Anthony with something in his hand to bash his brains in. Again, an interesting kind of correlation to the original episode with Aunt Amy trying to pick up the fire poker and then not being able to. But here, in this case, Audrey sees the man coming up behind him and sends him away. And then that starts a chain reaction. She has now protected Anthony, and then she turns around, notices Agnes, and reads Agnes's mind. Agnes is thinking negative thoughts, and she sends Agnes away. And then she starts sending everyone away. And man, that was just really cool to me. Really awesome. And it just leaves Anthony and Audrey alone. And I really like the kind of change up, the switchers, the kind of the switcheroo, or the red herring that we have here, because up until that moment, the plan was to have Audrey send Anthony away and rid the world of this evil and everything, and start bringing back everything else. But instead, Audrey succumbs to the power inherent within her in an effort to protect her father and just living with this power. And so she has then sent everyone away, and now it's just Anthony and Audrey. And so I really like that. I just found it really interesting, and I have a theory about that I don't know if this is something that was intentional or if this was something that they really intended with it. But I have a theory that my thinking of this is that the constant adulation toward Anthony that everyone for the last 40 years have just trained themselves to do as a sign of self-preservation in the face of this monster, the constant adulation that Audrey has witnessed throughout her entire life, seeing everyone just shower Anthony with praise and everything, makes Audrey revere him even more. Like, even outside of him being her father, I kind of feel like maybe this is meant to be, or maybe there's a read of it where she has witnessed this adulation just her entire life, and that means that, okay, everyone is good, everyone loves Anthony, so that means that he is worth loving and he is worth not questioning and everything. And so I kind of feel like that kind of messes with her mind a little bit, and it kind of all comes to a head at this scene where she sends everyone away. And another thing I found really interesting about this is after she sends everyone away, after it's just Anthony and Audrey, Anthony says, "Audrey, what have you done?" And I feel like that little piece of dialogue in the next scene coming up is Anthony finally reckoning with his actions. He's finally seen the monstrosity of his actions through his daughter's behavior. And I think that is such a rich and deep kind of character beat, and a really, really, frankly, I'll just say it felt like it was a lot stronger in terms of writing than I would have expected this iteration of the Twilight Zone to be capable of. I just thought it was really, really interesting. So then the next scene, we get kind of the denouement of Anthony and Audrey at home playing the piano by themselves and with their minds, and Anthony is lonely. And this is too quick. It's just way too quick for my liking. So Anthony says that he's lonely, and Audrey says, I bet I know what would cheer you up. And then she just brings everything back. There's a plane flying overhead, which I think was really cool. And really interesting, too, because this episode aired in 2003, and around that same time, there was a similar scene sort of with 28 Days Later, where there's a plane flying overhead as a revelation of something. Anyway, check out Patreon, where I will be doing a commentary track for 28 Days Later, probably in August. Anyway, this all kind of feels like a little bit of a cop-out at the end. Like kind of a have their cake and eat it too. Because just with the blink of an eye, Audrey's able to just reset everything. Everything's back to normal. Everything is fine. Solely because Anthony is lonely. And I kind of feel like I don't know. I don't like it. I kind of feel like I wish that there was more to it. I wish that there was a little bit more to what brings everything back, not just to Peaksville, but to the world as a whole. So I don't know. I don't know. I kind of felt like it was just a little bit of an afterthought kind of thing. Like, okay, well, Audrey can bring everything back. So this big moment where she sends everyone away in a rage, it lessens the impact of that because the very next scene she's bringing everything back anyway. So I don't know, it just kind of felt a little bit hollow. And so there's a couple in a car that are like, hey, can you get us directions to wherever? And so the episode ends with Anthony walking toward them and telling Audrey it's going to be a good day. It's going to be a really good day. And so then they walk toward the couple, and the actual scene transitions to black and white as they're walking toward the couple to give directions, and then it kind of closes in on them as a circle. Also, and I'll play the closing narration here in a second, but I do want to say that the logistics of all of this is completely head-scratching to me. Like, did it reset everything? Is it like an endgame thing where now 40 years later everyone has returned and everything is back to normal 40 years later? Or has it reset everything to where it's like an alternate timeline thing? I don't know. It's a head-scratcher, but I will say this. If I can forgive Endgame for that same kind of logistical issues, I can obviously forgive the Twilight Zone, so I'm not going to think too much about it. So here's a closing narration from Forrest Whitaker from It's Still a Good Life.
It's gonna be a good day. Real good day.
No lesson to be learned here. No morals to be taught. Just an update from Peaksville, Ohio, where Anthony and Audrey Fremont want you to think happy thoughts. And you better do as you're told. Otherwise, you might wind up in that cornfield known as the Twilight Zone.
And that's the episode of It's Still a Good Life. I do have a few pieces of trivia here, just really quick things. One is that it was produced as a sequel to the classic Twilight Zone episode It's a Good Life, of course. And also, as of whenever, I don't know if this is still the case, but according to IMDb, this episode holds the record at 41 years and 3 months for the longest interval between a television episode and its sequel. So I think that's pretty interesting. And also, as I noted early in this episode, or a week ago, this is the only sequel in the history of the Twilight Zone, so that's pretty cool. And also, unusually, the opening narration does not include the words "The Twilight Zone." So overall thoughts, It's Still a Good Life, I thought was a lot better than I expected it to be honest. It really, I found it very captivating as a continuation of the original series episode, and I thought that it was just really solid, especially it seemed like it was a little bit better than what the other episodes of this iteration of the Twilight Zone were, and it feels like it has a pretty good place in the pantheon of the Twilight Zone, especially as being the only sequel. Obviously, I prefer the original much, much better, but I do like that there's a charm to it, that this is actually a continuation of the story rather than a remake. And I still say, I know that I've said this probably on multiple episodes at this point, but it still pains me so much that I just wish that there was, I just wish that there was, if I could pick one episode so far in the Twilight Zone to have a sequel, I wish that it would have been the Shadow Play. I really wish that the 80s version would have been a continuation, and like the 2000s version would have been a continuation, and that the 2019 version would have been a continuation. I wish that, God, like that is such a missed opportunity. But I digress. So yeah, so I guess that's it for this episode of Anthology. Thank you guys so much for listening and everything. I don't really have anything else to say. Next time on the podcast, I'm going to be reviewing Death's Head Revisited, which, or in other words, another episode of the Twilight Zone. I'm going to be reviewing the next episode of the Twilight Zone, which famously the Twilight Zone has no political leanings or any political messaging or anything, if you are to believe the people who were pissed off about the 2019 remake. But yeah, so next up on the famously unpolitical Twilight Zone is Death's Head Revisited, about a Nazi general who returns to Dachau and reaps what he sows, and you know. Anyway, this bit has gone on long enough. Next time, Death's Head Revisited, Twilight Zone Season 3, Episode 9. My bonus review is, I know you guys are excited, I'm going back to science fiction theater. Season 1, Episode 17, The Lost Heartbeat. Yeah, and then also, next, as of the day that this episode drops, next Friday, May 21st, I'm going to start my bonus episode review series on Amazon Prime's new sci-fi anthology show, Solos, which premieres all 7 episodes on May 21st. On the main feed, I'm going to have my first review for the first episode on May 21st, so it'll be right there. But if you guys want to support me on Patreon at the $10 level, you will get instant access to all 7 episodes of that bonus episode series on May 21st immediately. Whereas everyone else who listens week to week will get week to week episodes for that bonus episode series. So consider checking out patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. I have tons of bonus content there. It's actually kind of obscene how much content is there. So once again, $10, instant access to all 7 episodes, May 21st. Very excited about that. And yeah, that'll do it for this episode of Anthology. I want to just say thank you guys so much for listening. And yeah, check out my other podcasts, Obsessive Viewer and Tower Junkies. And again, final plug for Patreon, patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. All right, well, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. And now, here's a short clip from our Patreon exclusive RSS feed. To hear the full clip and more exclusive Patreon content, go to patreon.com/obsessiveviewer and become a patron at the minimum rate of $1 per month. Thank you and enjoy.
Wes Anderson, I'm just so up and down on. Like, it's not. He's a great filmmaker, and I love that he has his own style and he sticks to it. But I'm not. It's so moody and so
specific.
So specific. Mm-hmm. That's a great way to put it. And like, again, like what's the Grand Budapest Hotel? Phenomenal movie. Yeah. Loved it. And a couple of his other ones, great. But just sometimes I'm just not. You really got to be in the right mood for Wes Anderson.
100%.
Whereas Paul Thomas Anderson, like, I could throw on any one of his movies, especially There Will Be Blood. That's like a top 10 for me.
Yes.
See, yes and no for me.
Yeah.
Just because I feel like Paul Thomas Anderson is also one of those filmmakers that I feel like I need to be in a certain mood for.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but it's a different kind of beast, because I think that in terms of Wes Anderson, it's such a whimsical and weird reality that he presents that I kind of feel like I need to be in a specific mindset for that experience. Whereas with Paul Thomas Anderson, I feel like I need to be more attentive to it.
Yeah,
in
that's
terms
true.
of my approach to it.
Anthology is edited and produced by Matt Hurt and presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. For a full archive of our episodes, go to anthologypod.com/archive. You can also like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod and follow the show on Twitter at OVAnthologyPod. If you enjoy the show, please take a couple minutes to leave us a rating and a quick review on Apple Podcasts. This is the easiest way to support what we do, and all it costs is a little bit of your time. If you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can make a PayPal donation at anthologypod.com/donate or support us on Patreon for recurring donations and access to commentary tracks and B-roll audio recorded exclusively for patrons at patreon.com/obsessiveviewer. Every donation goes toward paying the fees to keep the podcast running and is greatly appreciated. Official Anthology merch, including shirts, mugs, phone cases, and more, can be found in the Obsessive Viewers TeePublic store. You can find a link to the store in the show notes of this episode and at anthologypod.com/donate. Or you can simply search for Obsessive Viewer at tpublic.com. For information about the Obsessive Viewers annual live event showcasing short horror films from local filmmakers, check out shocktoberinirvington.com. And for an archive of all our events, as well as news about potential future events, head over to obsessiveviewer.com/live. For more podcast content, you can find our flagship movie and TV review and discussion show, The Obsessive Viewer Podcast, at obsessiveviewer.com, and on Twitter at obsessiveviewer. You can also find Tower Junkies, a podcast where Matt and co-host Tiny share their love of all things Stephen King and his magnum opus, The Dark Tower series, over at towerjunkiespod.com and at towerjunkiespod on Twitter. And finally, check out The Secular Perspective, Tiny's side project podcast, which tackles current events and life's big questions from the perspective of secular hosts Chad and Amanda at thesecularperspective.com. Bumper music for this podcast comes courtesy of As Good As It Gets, which can be found at facebook.com/asgoodasitgetsband. You can also find As Good As It Gets music on Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Kitty!